Black waiter rescued the deaf father of a millionaire. His sign language left everyone shocked. Ethan Brooks had mastered the art of being invisible. For 2 years, he worked quietly at Maison Lumière, one of Chicago's most luxurious restaurants, where the chandeliers sparkled brighter than most people's futures, and silence was served alongside every course. Ethan moved through the marble halls with grace. Polished shoes, crisp uniform, steady hands carrying trays worth more than his weekly paycheck. To the wealthy diners, he was just another face in black and white, polite, efficient, forgettable. But beneath that calm, professional mask lived a man who had once been something entirely different. Every morning began the same. The alarm buzzed in his small one-bedroom apartment on the south side. He'd wake before sunrise, iron his uniform with precision, and take the crowded train downtown. The other passengers were half asleep, faces buried in phones, while Ethan stared out the window, watching the city wake up. He'd once looked at these skyscrapers with ambition. Now he looked at them with quiet endurance. At Maison Lumière, hierarchy ruled everything. The staff wore smiles that didn't always reach their eyes. The wealthy clientele dined in luxury, unaware or perhaps indifferent to the lives of those serving them. Ethan never complained. He needed the job. Rent wasn't forgiving, and opportunities were scarce for someone whose name, once respected in corporate circles, had been quietly blacklisted. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. Most co-workers liked Ethan. He worked hard, never argued, and helped others when the pressure got too high. But there were a few, especially Richard Hale, the restaurant manager, who saw him differently. Richard's tone was always sharp, his compliments backhanded, his authority tinged with something colder. To him, Ethan was just another server lucky to be in such a refined establishment. Sometimes it wasn't what Richard said, it was how he said it. The subtle digs, the raised eyebrow, the deliberate mispronunciation of his name when high-profile guests were watching. Ethan learned to swallow his pride. In places like Maison Lumière, pride was a luxury for the rich. Yet, no matter how invisible he tried to be, Ethan carried something that made him different. A quiet intelligence and an air of control, as if he didn't belong in a waiter's uniform. When new staff joined, they often mistook him for a supervisor. His posture was too confident, his speech too measured. But whenever someone asked about his past, he'd deflect with a gentle smile and a change of subject. There were hints, though. The way he handled the restaurant's computer system was like a seasoned professional. How he once helped a supplier fix a billing issue in minutes that had stumped management for hours. Even Richard had noticed and didn't like it. "Stick to your tray, Brooks," he'd once muttered under his breath. Ethan didn't fight back. He couldn't afford to. But deep down, something inside him ached. He remembered the days when he used to sit in corporate boardrooms, advising CEOs on ethics and leadership. Back when people shook his hand with respect, not suspicion. Those memories were both comfort and curse, reminders of what he'd lost and what he still believed in. Doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. His only source of peace was his sister, Amara, who had been born deaf. Growing up, Ethan had learned sign language just to communicate with her, and it became second nature, a secret connection between them. On his days off, he'd visit her small apartment, help her with errands, and laugh at her expressive jokes. She was his grounding force, the only person who knew the full truth about his past and how it had all fallen apart. Ethan's fall from grace wasn't public, but it was devastating. He'd once been one of the youngest consultants to ever rise at a major firm. But one decision, to expose corruption inside a billion-dollar company, cost him everything. Lies spread faster than truth, and in a world driven by power, honesty had no allies. The system turned its back on him, and so he disappeared. Now, Maison Lumière was his quiet exile. Still, Ethan never lost his sense of dignity. He treated every guest with care, every coworker with kindness, and every day with a calm focus that hid the storm inside. Sometimes, when he carried trays past the glass windows, he'd see his reflection and barely recognize the man staring back. But he told himself this was temporary, that one day things would change. That change began on a Friday night. It was one of those evenings where everything gleamed, the golden chandeliers, the wine glasses lined like soldiers, the low hum of wealthy laughter filling the air. The kind of night where everyone pretended the world outside didn't exist. Ethan was stationed near the main dining hall, attentive but detached, his mind half lost in the rhythm of work. At table 6 sat Mr. Harold Collins, an elegant man in his late 60s, with eyes that seemed both kind and commanding. Across from him was his daughter, Isabella Collins, a well-known millionaire CEO whose name graced magazine covers. Her presence carried weight, her tone confident, her gestures precise, her expression unreadable. To everyone around, it was just another business dinner between power and legacy. But to Ethan, there was something different about them. He noticed the way the old man's hands moved occasionally, subtle gestures that seemed to have meaning. Few others would notice. Most didn't care. As Ethan refilled a glass of water, he glanced toward them again. Mr. Collins smiled faintly, then hesitated, his hand trembling just slightly as he reached for his napkin. Something about it felt off. Ethan couldn't explain it, but instinct told him to stay close. He had no idea that within minutes, everything about his quiet, hidden life would be shattered, and that the world would soon see the man behind the uniform. Because sometimes the people we overlook are the ones carrying stories powerful enough to change everything. The air inside Maison Lumière shifted in an instant. One moment, laughter and the clinking of silverware filled the room. The next, gasps of panic cut through the music. At table 6, Mr. Harold Collins was clutching his chest, his eyes wide with terror. His daughter, Isabella, froze mid-sentence, unsure what was happening. The waitstaff hesitated, looking to one another for direction, waiting for someone, anyone, to act. Ethan Brooks didn't wait. The subtle movements of Mr. Collins's hands weren't random. They were signs. Words, desperate ones, only someone who understood could read. He wasn't choking on food. He was trying to tell them he couldn't reach his medication. Ethan dropped his tray and rushed forward. In a single motion, he steadied the older man, signed back, and sprinted to retrieve a small vial from the man's coat pocket. Within seconds, the pills were swallowed, the breathing eased, and silence fell over the entire restaurant. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then a slow ripple of whispers moved through the dining hall. Shock, confusion, disbelief. A waiter had just saved a millionaire's father. Cameras flashed. Guests craned their necks. Isabella's expression shifted from irritation to disbelief, and finally to shame. Her father looked up at Ethan with watery eyes and signed 2 simple words. "Thank you." Ethan nodded, his pulse pounding. He turned to step away, but Isabella stopped him. "Wait," she said softly, her voice trembling. You know sign language?" Ethan nodded again, explaining briefly that his sister was deaf. For the first time that night, the millionaire CEO smiled. Not the practiced corporate kind, but something genuine. "Would you teach me a few words?" she asked. Around them, every guest watched as she mimicked Ethan's gestures, slowly signing thank you back to her father. For a brief moment, the restaurant glowed with something rare, humanity. But not everyone saw it that way. From the far corner, Richard Hale's jaw was clenched tight. To him, Ethan's heroic act had disrupted the evening's order. When the crowd's murmurs turned into praise, Richard saw only one thing: attention shifting away from management. Minutes later, as the Collins family was escorted out, Richard pulled Ethan aside. His voice was low, but sharp enough to cut glass. "You overstepped, Brooks. You're a server, not a doctor." Ethan tried to explain, but Richard didn't want an explanation. "Next time, wait for instructions." We can't afford theatrics in front of guests. The next day, whispers raced through the staff room. The hero waiter, they called him, but not everyone said it kindly. Some envied the spotlight, others feared management's reaction. Ethan stayed silent, returning to work as if nothing had happened, but tension hung heavy. Richard's gaze followed him everywhere, waiting for a mistake. 3 days later, everything changed again. Isabella Collins herself arrived at Maison Lumière, something unheard of for someone of her status. The dining room froze as she walked in, heels clicking against the marble, dressed not like a CEO, but like someone on a mission. "I'm here to see Ethan Brooks," she announced. Richard's face turned pale. VIPs didn't just visit the staff, but Isabella didn't care about protocol. She followed Ethan into a private booth, closing the curtain behind them. Her tone was calm but intense. She thanked him for saving her father and then, almost casually, began revealing things Ethan hadn't expected anyone to know. She knew where he'd studied, the University of Michigan. She knew about his MBA from Kellogg, his work at Bain & Company, and his reputation for exposing corporate fraud. "I did my research," she said quietly. "Men like you don't end up serving tables unless something went very wrong." Ethan's chest tightened. He'd tried so hard to bury that part of his life. But Isabella didn't stop. "My father remembers you," she continued. "He once investigated a company called Novacor Industries. He always said he wished he could have met someone on the inside brave enough to tell the truth. I think he already has." Ethan sat in stunned silence. She wasn't there to offer charity. She was offering redemption. A job. Director of Corporate Integrity at Collins Enterprises. A position that could restore everything he'd lost. But then she added one condition. "Your first case," she said, "is this restaurant." Ethan's breath caught. She explained that multiple complaints had surfaced about racial discrimination, wage theft, and toxic management at Maison Lumière. She wanted Ethan to investigate, and she wanted the truth no matter how ugly it was. Before he could respond, the curtain ripped open. Richard Hale stood there, red-faced and furious. "This area's for staff only," he barked. "Ethan, back to work. Now." But Isabella didn't flinch. "He doesn't work for you anymore," she said, her voice cold and steady. "From today, he reports directly to me." The room went silent. Staff gathered nearby, eyes wide. Ethan slowly removed his apron, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with the weight of everything he'd endured. "Actually," he said quietly, "I've been investigating for a while." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small flash drive. Every insult, every withheld tip, every discriminatory comment, it's all here. Richard's face drained of color. "You're bluffing." Isabella opened her laptop and pressed play. Richard's own voice filled the air. Mocking employees, making racist jokes, threatening to fire anyone who complained. The sound echoed through the hall like a verdict. The color left his face entirely. Within minutes, Isabella made it official. Collins Enterprises had just acquired Maison Lumière. Effective immediately, Richard Hale and his assistant were terminated. The staff stared in disbelief as Ethan stood where he'd once been scolded, now a man of authority. The rising tension that had simmered for months finally broke. But the real storm, the one that would expose an empire of corruption far beyond the restaurant, was only beginning. Because Ethan Brooks wasn't just reclaiming his career. He was about to challenge a system built on privilege and silence. And the world was about to see just how loud integrity could be. For days, the news spread like wildfire across Chicago's business circles. Waiter exposes corruption inside elite restaurant. Social media buzzed. Articles speculated, and people debated whether Ethan Brooks was a hero or a man who simply got lucky. But behind the headlines, Ethan's life was far from calm. Maison Lumière had been renamed under Collins Enterprises, but the damage done inside those walls ran deeper than policies could fix. What Ethan uncovered during his first weeks as director of corporate integrity wasn't just mismanagement. It was a network of deceit stretching far beyond the restaurant. Late nights turned into early mornings. Ethan combed through hidden invoices, manipulated payroll records, and secret contracts buried under layers of legal jargon. Each document painted a clearer picture. Maison Lumière had been funneling money through fake vendors tied to Novacore Industries, the very company that had destroyed Ethan's life 3 years earlier. The realization hit like a cold wave. The same empire that had blacklisted him had been using his new workplace as a laundering front all along. And suddenly, everything made sense. Richard Hale's arrogance, the untraceable cash bonuses for certain staff, the unspoken favoritism. It was all part of a system built to protect corruption and silence those who questioned it. Ethan had walked right into the heart of the beast he'd once tried to expose. He sat alone in his new office on the 32nd floor of Collins Tower, the city glittering below him. The glow of his laptop screen reflected in his tired eyes. On it, spreadsheets lined with numbers that could destroy careers. He could almost hear his former boss's words echo in his mind. People like us don't change systems, Ethan. We get crushed by them. But he wasn't the same man anymore. Ethan sent a message to Isabella, requesting an emergency meeting. Within hours, she and her father arrived, both tense but composed. When Ethan laid out the files, proof of Novacore's ties to Maison Lumière, Isabella's hands trembled. Her father, Harold Collins, leaned back, silent for a long time before speaking. You understand what this means, don't you? Novacore doesn't go down quietly. Ethan nodded. I know, but we can't stay silent either. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. Anonymous threats appeared in his inbox. A car followed him home one night. Then, a stranger slipped a note under his apartment door. Stop digging or you'll regret it. Still, he didn't stop. He organized his findings, built a team within Collins Enterprises, and began a quiet but unstoppable investigation. Every step brought new evidence and new danger. The pressure was unbearable, but so was the memory of all the people whose voices had been ignored, silenced, or dismissed because they didn't have power, wealth, or the right skin color. And then came the night of the board presentation. The top executives of Collins Enterprises gathered in a private conference room, their faces half-lit by the city skyline. Ethan stood before them, files in hand, his voice steady but his heart pounding. On the screen behind him flashed every lie Novacore had buried: false audits, racial discrimination in hiring practices, illegal kickbacks. Some board members exchanged uneasy glances. Others whispered, trying to gauge which way the wind was turning. Isabella watched in silence, her eyes locked on Ethan's. Then the door opened. Richard Hale walked in. It made no sense. He had been fired, disgraced, humiliated. Yet here he was, escorted by 2 lawyers from Novacore. His expression was smug, his tone venomous. Mr. Brooks, he said, I'd be very careful about the accusations you're making. Defamation is a serious crime. The room grew tense. Richard placed a folder on the table and slid it toward Isabella. These are the employment records showing Ethan Brooks was terminated from Bain & Company for misconduct and data theft. Ethan froze. It was the same fabricated evidence Novacore had used to ruin his career years ago. Richard smirked. People forget, but files don't. Whispers filled the room. Doubt flickered across faces that had once looked at Ethan with respect. The weight of it all threatened to crush him again. For a moment, he felt like that same broken man from 3 years ago, the one who lost everything because he dared to tell the truth. But then, Isabella spoke. Her voice was calm, but every word landed like a hammer. Enough! She turned to Richard. You forgot one thing. When Collins Enterprises acquires a company, we acquire everything, including surveillance archives. She nodded toward Ethan. He clicked his laptop. The projector lit up with a new video, grainy footage from Maison Lumière's security cameras. Richard's voice echoed through the speakers, recorded months earlier. "Novacor covers us. You think anyone's going to believe a black waiter over us?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went pale. His own words had become his undoing. Isabella stood. "This is your last day walking free," she said coldly. Security entered the room as Richard tried to protest, but the evidence was overwhelming. The once proud manager was escorted out, his arrogance collapsing under the weight of his own prejudice. Ethan didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in it, only relief, and a deep ache for every moment he'd spent doubting whether truth still mattered. When the room finally cleared, Harold Collins placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You did what most men are too afraid to do. You fought back, and you won." But Ethan wasn't sure if it felt like victory. He looked out the window at the city lights and thought of all the others who'd been silenced, all the voices drowned by money and power. He had won one battle, yes, but the war for fairness, for dignity, was far from over. That night, as he walked out of the tower and into the cold Chicago air, he passed by a group of waiters from Maison Lumière, now Brooks and Company. They recognized him, smiling with pride. He nodded back, humbled, because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about proving that even in a world designed to keep some people silent, integrity could still roar louder than money. And as the wind swept through the streets, carrying the city's noise into the night, Ethan Brooks knew this was only the beginning of something far greater than himself. 6 months later, the skyline of Chicago looked different to Ethan Brooks. Maybe it was the same city, the same towers, the same endless hum of ambition. But something inside him had changed so profoundly that even the streets he once walked in silence now felt like a victory march. He stood at the window of his new office on the 32nd floor of Collins Tower, the morning sun spilling across his desk like a quiet reminder. He had survived the storm. The plaque on the door read Director of Corporate Integrity, Ethan Brooks. The same man who used to carry trays now carried truth. And though his job title had changed, his mission hadn't. He was still serving people, only this time he was serving justice. The world had watched as the story unfolded. Black waiter exposes corporate racism in Chicago's elite restaurant. But what most people didn't see was the aftermath. The long nights, the rebuilding, the healing. Maison Lumière was no longer a place of silence and fear. Under new ownership, it had been renamed Brooks and Company, a restaurant built on transparency, respect, and dignity. Ethan refused to let anyone forget the truth of what happened within those walls, but he also refused to let bitterness define the future. Every staff member, from servers to kitchen workers, now earns fair wages. Tips were transparent, and every employee received anti-discrimination training. The same dining room that once silenced its workers now echoed with laughter and equality. The staff who had once avoided eye contact with management now greeted their guests with pride, knowing they were part of something honest. Maria Lopez, the kind waitress who had once defended Ethan from Richard's cutting remarks, now stood as the restaurant's general manager. Her eyes still held the same fire, but now they reflected power, earned power. She often said that working for Brooks and Company felt like finally breathing in a place that once suffocated you. As for Richard Hale, the story didn't end with his arrest. His name became a warning in business circles, a case study in how arrogance and racism can destroy even the most powerful. He was later sentenced to prison for fraud and workplace discrimination. The same voice that once barked orders at waiters now echoed inside cold, gray walls. But Ethan never spoke of revenge. When reporters asked him how it felt to see his old manager in handcuffs, his answer was always the same. The best revenge isn't destroying what broke you. It's building something better in its place. That line spread across the internet, shared millions of times. It wasn't just about a restaurant. It was about every workplace, every system that had looked at people like Ethan and decided they were less. Under Ethan's leadership, Collins Enterprises transformed. His department uncovered over $1.4 billion in fraud and helped reform dozens of corrupt companies. But beyond the numbers, something deeper was happening. People were beginning to see that integrity wasn't weakness, that honesty could still win, even in a world addicted to shortcuts. One afternoon, the Collins family hosted a company-wide celebration. Isabella stood before the crowd, employees, partners, and families, all gathered in the glass atrium of Collins Tower. Her voice was clear, her words deliberate. My father always told me that true power isn't measured by wealth or status, but by how you treat people when you have none. Ethan reminded us of that truth. Harold Collins, seated beside her, nodded proudly. Leadership, he said, isn't about money. It's about integrity. And sometimes the people we overlook the most are the ones who carry it. As applause filled the hall, Ethan's eyes wandered toward the far corner, where a young waiter, barely 20, stood watching him with quiet admiration. Their eyes met, and the boy smiled shyly. In that instant, Ethan saw himself years ago, tired, invisible, underestimated. And he realized this was the real impact. Because change doesn't happen in boardrooms or through headlines, it happens when one person's courage permits someone else to believe again. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed, Ethan stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the glittering city. The cold wind carried the distant sounds of traffic, laughter, and life. For the first time in years, he felt peace. He thought of his sister, Amara, who had been there from the beginning, the one who taught him that silence could speak louder than words. Her deafness had once been a challenge. Now, it was a symbol of strength. It was her language, the language that had saved a man's life and exposed an empire. Looking out across Chicago, Ethan smiled. "We did it," he whispered. Not just for himself, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. Because this story was never just about racism or corruption. It was about the quiet fight to be seen, heard, and valued in a world that so often refuses to listen. It was about the resilience of those who refuse to give up, even when life tries to erase them. And as the final rays of sunlight disappeared behind the skyline, Ethan's voice lingered in the narrator's words. Sometimes life breaks you just to rebuild you stronger. Those who stay honest, even when the world turns against them, don't just rise again. They rebuild the very system that tried to destroy them. Then, a final question filled the screen, fading into silence. If one man's courage could expose the truth and change an entire company, what could happen if all of us refused to stay silent? What did you think of Ethan's journey? From a quiet waiter no one noticed to the man who exposed the truth and rebuilt everything with integrity. Do you believe one person's courage can really change an entire system? Or was Ethan just in the right place at the right time? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful real-life stories that inspire change.